In the late 4th century, Augustine is one of the first church fathers to comment on the relationship between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and also John. And he has this to say: "For Matthew is understood to have taken it in hand to construct the record of the incarnation of the Lord according to the royal lineage, and to give an account of most part of his deeds and words as they stood in relation to his present life of men. Mark follows Matthew closely and looks like his attendant and epitomizer. For in Mark's narrative, he gives nothing in concert with John apart from the others. By himself separately, though, he has little to record. In conjunction with Luke, as distinguished from the rest, he has still less. But in concord with Matthew, he has a very large number of passages. Much, too, he narrates in words almost numerically and identically the same as those used by Matthew, where the agreement is either with that evangelist alone or with him in connection with the rest." So what Augustine tells us here primarily is that there is a whole lot of overlap between Matthew and Mark. Augustine understands Mark to be utilizing Matthew and shortening Matthew. So Augustine knows Matthew to be the first written gospel and Mark to follow as the epitomizer. And Augustine also comments a little bit on Mark's relationship to Luke and Matthew and those things that all three share together, as well as how John sort of stands to the side a little bit of all three of these gospels that we now call the Synoptic Gospels. That is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And what we're going to do is take Augustine's testimony here as sort of a entry point for addressing what we call the Synoptic Problem. So the Synoptic Problem, as defined by one of the foremost scholars on this problem, Mark Goodacre, defines it this way: the study of the similarities and the differences between the Synoptic Gospels, namely Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we'll talk about why they're called Synoptic Gospels in just a moment. So the study of the similarities and differences between the Synoptic Gospels in an attempt to explain their literary relationship. So how do Matthew, Mark, and Luke relate to one another? Who was using whom in the process of composing these three Gospels? So the word synoptic very literally means seen together. And what we find, and one of the texts that I've asked you to purchase for this class, is a gospel synopsis, wherein Matthew, Mark, and Luke can be put literally next to each other in parallel columns. And Johann Jacob Griesbach was one of the first people to do this in 1776, so that his gospel parallel, this is not Griesbach's gospel parallel, this is the gospel parallel that I've asked you to acquire for this class, but Griesbach's innovation of putting the gospels side by side really opened up a sort of new way of comparing Matthew, Mark, and Luke together with one another. And it allowed scholars to see very clearly the similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, so that it became very clear that there was literary dependence between these three Gospels. And figuring out that literary dependence was sort of became the Synoptic Problem. Figuring out which Gospel comes first, which Gospel comes second, which Gospel comes third, and how each one relates to the ones that came before it. So returning back to what Augustine had to say about the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's going to be some things that Augustine was probably wrong about them. Most scholars now think Augustine got wrong. The first is the first written gospel. So for Augustine, Matthew was the gospel progenitor, the first one to write down a gospel, and Mark followed Matthew. But nowadays, most scholars are going to reverse that order and say that Mark was written first. And this is what we call Markane priority. And the reason that most people now think Mark was written first is that if Mark is looking at Matthew and using Matthew, he has decided to leave out some really, really important stuff from Matthew's gospel. He's decided to cut out things that would have been very important for an audience to have experienced or to have read. things like Jesus's birth. The Gospel of Mark, as you experienced last week, just starts right in with Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist. We don't have anything about Jesus's birth or his childhood. And then also on the other side of Mark's Gospel ends very abruptly, so that if Mark is following Matthew, he's cut out Jesus's appearances to his disciples after the resurrection, which are narrated in the Gospel of Matthew. He's also left out things like the famous Sermon on the Mount, and many, many other things. So the fact that Mark leaves out all this stuff, or the idea that Mark would leave out all of this stuff, seems pretty impractical if you were to be following Matthew. So the more likely scenario, scholars purport, is that Mark writes first and Matthew writes second, sort of filling in these things that are left out from Mark. And then another main point in favor of Markane priority, or the idea that Mark wrote first and then Matthew followed Mark, is that the language of Mark is much more literary. It's much more stylistic than is the language of Matthew. So Mark writes in this sort of colloquial language. And one of the things we talked about last week was what kind of reading event, or what kind of way in which an audience might have experienced Mark. And we talked about Mark sort of being this sort of performative kind of thing. And I even offered you the optional opportunity to take a look at Phil Ruge Jones's performance of the Gospel of Mark. That even now, even today, the Gospel of Mark still works well as a performance that's sort of memorized and given to an audience. And the result of that sort of performance nature of Mark, is that Mark's language is very colloquial. It reads as though someone is telling the story from the spoken word, that they're telling it in a sort of more impromptu, engaging sort of way. Matthew doesn't read like this, and this is probably the experience you'll have this week as I ask you to read Matthew in its entirety. What Matthew does is he takes Mark's sort of colloquial language, those repetitions of "and this happened, and that happened, and this happened," and makes it much more literary. He puts clauses into complex relationship with one another, uses a number of different coordinating conjunctions in comparison to Mark's coordinating conjunction. So whereas Mark has coordination, and this, and this, and this, Matthew has a lot more subordination of clauses, where sentences are a lot more complex in Matthew's gospel. And when we edit material, when we edit written material, we look at words visualized on a page. What we tend to do in writing is remove the things that are sort of characteristic of the spoken word. We find those things to be unliterary or ungrammatical, and they tend to be sort of scrubbed out in written versions. So scholars look at Matthew and Mark's language and they say, well, Matthew is much better written. It appears that Matthew has taken Mark's more colloquial language and made it into something that's a bit more literary. But this is not to say that Augustine was wrong about everything in his comments on the Synoptic Gospels, and particularly Matthew and Mark's relationship to one another. He was very, very right that quite a bit of Mark also appears in Matthew, so that Matthew sort of subsumes about 90% of Mark. So as to the three Synoptic Gospels, Mark only has sort of about 10% of its own unique contribution to those three Gospels. So because Matthew subsumes 90% of Mark, and Luke doesn't subsume quite as much as Matthew does. Luke contains about 50% of Mark. And so those places where we see that there's a relationship between the three, and there's a close literary relationship, as Augustine tells us, where all three Gospels, all three Synoptic Gospels have that material, this is what we call the triple tradition. So this is going to be one of the important terms for this week. The triple tradition material, or triple tradition passages, or pericopes. A pericope is a word for a discrete episode, a narrative episode. This is going to be material material that appears in all three synoptic gospels. And so the beauty of a gospel synopsis or a gospel parallel is that you can see an episode that might occur in different places in each distinctive synoptic gospel is set right next to each other. So you can directly compare all three passages with one another and see what the similarities and differences are between the three. In the third video for this week, I'm going to give you sort of modus operandi for marking and observing the similarities and differences between the different gospels, the different synoptic gospels. But what I want you to do at this point is, having not experienced this method that I'm going to lay out for you, I want you to take a look at this passage from the Triple Tradition, a nice short one on Jesus's true relatives. And note the similarities and differences that you notice in the text. So just pause the lecture here, taking a look at this passage, see what you notice is similar between the Synoptic Gospels and what's different between the Synoptic Gospels. So we're going to return to this passage when I offer you the sort of method for engaging and visualizing the similarities and differences between the Synoptic Gospels. So sort of hold on to what you've done here in the lecture pause, and we're going to come back to it later on in the third video for this week. And so Augustine also noted that Matthew and Luke share a great deal of literary material that is not found in Mark. That we have these Matthew and Luke overlaps. We have entire episodes that occur in Matthew and Luke, but they don't occur in Mark. And this is what is called the double tradition, material that appears in Matthew and in Luke. So when you look at your gospel parallel book, it's going to look like this. There is no what is called the middle term. Mark is the middle term between Matthew and Luke. In the double tradition, Matthew and Luke overlap with one another, and you can see in this passage every word except for one is identical between Matthew and Luke, but there's none of this in Mark. So this is the unique material shared between Matthew and Luke that does not appear in the Gospel of Mark. And what we're going to look at in the next video, or one of the primary things we'll look at in the next video, is how scholars make sense of this very exact overlap between Matthew and Luke. Before we move to that next video, we want to talk about why scholars think that the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke is literary and not oral dependency. So one sort of idea could be, and one idea that has been floated in the past is, well, you know, in the ancient world, everyone was sort of more into oral tradition, that stories were passed around by speaking. And this is all well and good, but what happens when we actually look at the parallels in our synopsis is that they are so close, and oftentimes the passages are so long that it's simply far too much to be held in memory. No matter how much better an ancient person's memory might have been than our own in modernity, there's just simply too much that could be held in the brain at one time. So the overlap is too much. The verbatim wording strongly suggests that there is eye contact between these synoptic authors. Another point in favor of there being literary dependency between the synoptic gospels and not simply oral tradition standing behind these things is the order of the events, is that the gospels sort of follow a very similar order. Both Matthew and Luke seem to follow Mark's order. And if it was simply the case that Matthew and Luke were sort of dealing with the oral tradition, or they were remembering an oral tradition, it would be quite coincidental that they follow what happens in Mark so closely. The sort of order of Jesus's ministry, the way that Matthew and Luke follow the similar arc to Mark suggests that we have eye contact with a continuous text rather than simply recalling Mark or the oral tradition from memory. And then the last bit is that Luke himself in Luke 1:1-4, the preface to Luke, says that he has engaged other sources. He says that other people have sort of attempted to draw up an account of what has happened among us, what happened with Jesus' life. And so Luke too decided to write. So Luke makes this allusion to other texts, implying that he knows of these other texts, and he doesn't go so far as to say that he used them, but by calling attention to knowing about their existence, it's not sort of a far step to say, well, if Luke knows about these, he probably also used them.